Hi guys! So I just did a poll on Twitter to see which video you would like to see next, and the absolute consensus was cosy reads for a winter night, so winter reading recommendations, which I completely get because it has massively changed in terms of temperature in the UK. It is so cold, I have my heating on right now, it feels like winter is here, and it's dark in the evenings, and I can completely sympathise with all of you who want to cosy up under a quilt somewhere warm with a warm cup of tea or hot chocolate in the evenings and a good book. So these are my recommendations for books that I think are particularly wintry and cosy. Some of them are more cheerful, some of them are a little bit darker, but there's something about them that just to me screamed curling up next to the fire vibes. So without further ado, let's get into the books. First up, I'm going to mention a book by one of my favourite authors who I'm sure you've heard me mention in the past, and that is Hogfather by Terry Pratchett. So this is one of Terry Pratchett's Discworld, as most of his novels are. The vast majority of novels that Terry Pratchett wrote in his lifetime were set on this planet of his own creation, which is a disc that rides on the back of 4 elephants that rides on the back of a giant turtle through space. They are fantasy books, and they're also comical fantasy books. Every time I read a Terry Pratchett book I laugh out loud, and Hogfather is one of my favourites. So Hogfather follows Death's granddaughter. So in the Discworld, Death is a personified being, a bit like the Grim Reaper. He calls himself an anthropomorphic personification, and he adopted a daughter who then went on to have her own daughter, and that is Death's granddaughter, Susan. So we follow Death, we follow Susan, and we follow the Hogfather. So the Hogfather is kind of like the Discworld's equivalent of Santa Claus, and it is that time of year in the Discworld where people are getting ready for Hogswatch, and it mirrors a lot of the aspects of Christmas and sort of other kind of wintry seasonal holidays. So of course I had to include it in my winter reading recommendations video. I personally feel you can read this book without having read any other Discworld books. I feel that about most of the Discworld books, and I actually have a video all about where to start with the Discworld if you're interested. It is technically not the first book about Death, but it is the first book about Susan, Death's granddaughter. So although it kind of comes in a series about Death, it's also kind of the beginning of Susan's story, so that's why I think you can start there, and you will get any context you really need from the novel and still be able to enjoy it. Not only is the Hogfather in this one, you will also meet creatures like the Tooth Fairy and the strange little monster that steals your socks so you never have a matching pair, and it's just so imaginative, so witty, and I love it. Next up I have a graphic novel though, and that is the Encyclopedia of Early Earth by Isabel Greenberg. So this book is set in a cold, icy place, which is why I thought it was a particularly appropriate winter read. It's also a big chunky graphic novel with gorgeous illustrations that you can just really get into of an evening, and it's one of those stories that is a story within a story within a story, and the characters are constantly telling one another tales, which again makes me reminiscent of winter and that sort of like storytelling atmosphere, sharing stories with people around a fire, as much as I have never done that, but that image feels very wintry to me. But at the centre it follows our protagonist, a young man from the North Pole travelling to the South Pole who falls in love, but his relationship is ill-fated, and we follow the adventure of these 2 young people as well as these stories they hear on their journey. I then thought I would go for a detective novel because I think there's something about a cosy detective story, particularly those kind of more traditional late 1800s, early 1900s detective stories that I love so much that feels wintry and cosy, and the one I'm going to recommend to you is The Red House Mystery by A.A. Milne. Now I've mentioned this book a few times before, and I always say yes, that's A.A. Milne, because if you've not heard me talk about this book before and you've not seen this book before, you might not know that the very man who wrote Winnie the Pooh also wrote a detective novel, and it is brilliant. I wish so much that A.A. Milne had had a chance to publish more detective novels, but I'm still grateful that this one exists because it's so much fun. It is in a way quite tongue-in-cheek. It very much plays on the Sherlock Watson tropes of the clever detective and the sidekick narrator, but it's very self-aware, and it sort of makes reference to that. So if you like Sherlock Holmes, that's a lot of fun, but you certainly don't need to have read Sherlock Holmes to read this book. It is witty and clever, and you don't see the mystery coming, you don't know what the end is, which is something I enjoy in a mystery novel, and it's just so well written. It really fulfills that cosy detective story definition for me. I then thought that some fairy tales might be appropriate, and I decided to go for the collection The Turnip Princess and Other Fairy Tales. So this is a collected volume of fairy tale stories published by Penguin, a bit like the Grimm's Brothers or Italo Calvino's Italian folk tales, and these were written down in the 1850s by a fairy tale collector travelling through Bavaria. And like I mentioned, Penguin published the first English translation of these German fairy tales, and this is just such a quintessential fairy tale collection. It has all the darker elements of traditional fairy tales, and I absolutely love this collection. I just find there's something about reading an entire collection of traditional fairy tales from beginning to end that's so cosy and wintry and magical. Maybe that's just what I want from a winter read, but I think that this one is definitely worth checking out if you're at all interested in fairy tales, short stories, those kind of things. My next book is quite a recent read for me, but it will be no surprise for you that I've included it on this list simply because of the title, and that is A Winter's Promise by Christelle Dabo. This is translated from the French. This is the English translation published by Europa Books, and it came out this year. A lot of people have been talking about it, so I'm sorry to bring it up again, but honestly I think this is just the perfect cozy winter read. Not only is that title indicative of that, but I think it's a nice chunky fantasy adventure which I think really suits this time of year and curling up with a book in the evenings. It's also set in a very cold climate, and I think a lot of people have compared it to his Dark Materials because of that, and I can see why. It's got this atmosphere, this chilly atmosphere that really suits this time of year. It follows our protagonist Ophelia, a young woman from a particular citadel in this world who has been betrothed to a man that she didn't choose for herself, but she has no choice but to marry, and travels to his citadel, City Celeste, for their engagement. And he turns out to be quite a gruff, grim man that she does not get on with, and there are lots of secrets going on in this world and this court that she is gradually learning about, and her role in this new society. And it's so imaginative. It's the first in a series, and I cannot wait for the next few in the series to be translated into English. On the topic of fantasy novels, I also wanted to mention A Great and Terrible Beauty by Libba Bray. This is the first in the Gemma Doyle trilogy, a series I absolutely adore. This is one of those books that for me, once I started it, I could not put it down, which is what I want in an evening read when it's dark outside and I don't plan on doing anything else. I want something compulsive that will just wrap me up, and these books do that. These books are set in the 1890s in London and follow our protagonist Gemma Doyle, who has just moved from India to a girls' finishing school just outside of London. She's a teenager because her mother has just passed away, so her family have all relocated back to England. But more than being a historical novel, it is also a bit of a paranormal fantasy novel. Gemma realises that she has access to this other world through sort of portal that only she can get into. And it's something she shared with her mother, and she's learning a lot about her mother's past through discovering this magical world, as well as getting to know the girls around her at her school and getting into trouble and kind of finding out some darker evils lurking in the world around her. It's full of so many different mysteries, fantastic characters, again really imaginative, fantastical, and there's something about historical novels that again I just think feel autumnal and wintry for me. On that topic, for me a perfect winter read is Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, if we want to go historical. This book is also set in the 1800s and was also written in the 1800s. It follows Jane Eyre, if you're not familiar, a young governess who takes on a role taking care of Mr. Rochester's young ward. It's also about the developing relationship between Jane Eyre and Mr. Rochester, as well as some secrets are going on in Mr. Rochester's house that she doesn't understand and is gradually learning about some dark secrets that he has. Again, it has elements of that darkness I think suits this time of year. It's a historical setting. There's definitely some colder scenes in there that I think again are suited to winter. This is one of those books that yes is incredibly hyped. It is probably one of the most popular historical novels written by women that I see talked about, but I think it deserves that praise. It's a really wonderful book, wonderful reading experience, and I love Jane Eyre as a character. I just think she is a very strong-willed young woman who knows what she wants, and I really enjoyed that. So if you've been putting this one off, I think now is the time to read it. But if you want dark and cold, then my next recommendation is The Secret History by Donna Tartt. This book is set at a New England college and follows our protagonist, a young man who has relocated to this college and wants to study classics, ancient Greek and Latin, along with a select few other students that make up a very small cliquey class with a specific professor, and he wants into this group because this is the subject that he's interested in, and he wants to be part of their little clique. They are all from incredibly wealthy backgrounds, whereas he is not, and he gradually finds himself kind of getting into their group, becoming one of their friends, and it's kind of what that means. These are not healthy friendships at all. It is such a weird little group cliquey mentality that he gets wrapped up in, and it's about the dark things that happen in their friendship group. There is a death, you know that from the offset. You don't necessarily know what or why this death has taken place, and part of the story is finding that out, and it's so well written. Donna Tartt is such a gorgeous writer. It's quite a slow-paced novel, but there's that element of mystery there. There's just the gorgeous prose, I think, just keeps you in that world and completely fascinated. But like I said, dark, very dark, but very good. But last but certainly not least is a book I could not leave out of this video. It will probably come as no surprise to you. It is not a book you will not have heard of, but if you haven't read it or just think it might be time for a reread, I wanted to remind you of it. And that is The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis. This is a classic children's fantasy novel, and I have loved it ever since I was a child. It follows a group of 4 siblings during World War II who are sent as refugees to live in the countryside in an old manor house away from the city where the bombs are falling. And whilst they're there, they stumble into Narnia through a portal in an old wardrobe. And Narnia is this magical world where they meet various different magical characters, but it is also currently under a spell. Narnia is currently under the control of the White Witch, who has made it always winter in Narnia, but most importantly, never Christmas. Always winter, never Christmas. Tragic. But it is just such a gorgeous, gorgeous novel. I love this story. I think whether you're a child or an adult, it is a classic for a reason, and if you haven't read it, I would highly recommend it. But also, if you have read it, you know, this is the perfect time for a reread. I myself am actually considering listening to this one on audiobook in December. It's cold, it's historical, it's magical, and apparently those are what I look for in a winter read. So those are all my recommendations for winter reading. I did do a video recommending some books to read during the autumnal season, which may still be relevant to you, so I will link that down below as well if you're interested. But I'd also love to hear from you what you would recommend as a cozy winter night's read to everybody watching, as well as me, because it is cold and I'm spending my evenings in my bed with books. So more recommendations the better. But until next time, happy reading, and I'll see you all again soon. Bye guys!